5 shocking true crime cases the world forgot. The wind that morning howled across the dunes of Wanda Beach like a living thing, sharp, dry, and cruel. It carried the scent of the ocean mixed with something else, something faintly metallic. Tuesday, January 12, 1965. The sun had barely risen when a man walking his dog noticed 2 shapes lying among the dunes. At first, he thought they were sunbathers, teenagers, maybe, resting after a long night. But as he drew closer, he saw the sand disturbed, shallow mounds piled unevenly around them. And then, the color. Not bronze, not tan, but pale, lifeless white. The police arrived within the hour. Their boots sank into the soft sand as they approached the bodies. 2 young girls, both around 15, both dressed in beach clothes. One was partially buried, her face turned toward the sea. The other lay nearby, her hair matted with sand, her hands stretched out toward her friend as if trying to reach her in those final seconds. The tide lapped quietly in the distance. Gulls circled above, crying out into the emptiness. That was the beginning of what would become one of Australia's most haunting unsolved crimes, the Wanda Beach Murders. Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt were best friends, inseparable, adventurous, and full of the kind of restless curiosity that often came with being 15 in the summer of the 1960s. Marianne was German-born, the eldest of 6 children, having moved to Sydney with her family after the war. Christine was Australian, outgoing and full of energy, the kind of girl who could make friends anywhere. The day before, January 11th, was supposed to be a fun day out. The girls had promised to take Marianne's younger siblings to the beach. They boarded the train to Cronulla with towels and sandwiches, laughing, teasing one another, talking about music and boys, the ordinary chatter of teenage life. They arrived at the beach just before noon. The summer air shimmered with heat. Witnesses later recalled seeing them giggling, splashing in the surf, running through the shallows with the smaller kids. But sometime after 1 p.m., the story begins to blur. The younger children were tired, hungry, and decided to head home. Marianne and Christine told them they'd stay behind for a little longer. They said they were going to pick up their belongings and meet the others later. They never came back. By nightfall, the Schmidt family was frantic. Police were notified. Trains were checked, stations searched, and the nearby dunes combed by flashlight. But there was no sign of the girls, no clothes, no towels, no footprints leading back to the train line. Until the next morning, the bodies had been discovered about 400 yards from the main beach, far enough away to be hidden from sight, but close enough that the killer must have known the area well. Detectives quickly determined that both girls had been attacked, their belongings scattered. But there was something stranger. The way the bodies had been positioned. Christine's head had been partially covered with sand, as if the killer had started to bury her, but stopped midway. Marianne's face was turned toward the ocean. There were drag marks, as if they had been moved, and carved faintly into the sand nearby were initials W and S. No one knew who they belonged to. Over the next few days, the case exploded in the headlines. "Beach horror!" screamed the Sydney Morning Herald. Reporters camped near the dunes. Locals whispered that a madman was loose on the coast. Parents forbade their children from going to the beach alone. Detective Inspector John Jones led the investigation. He described the crime scene as methodical yet chaotic. Whoever did this, he said, wasn't a first-timer. The precision of the burial attempts, the control of the scene, the way the girls had been isolated, all of it pointed to experience. Jones ordered an unprecedented canvass. Over 7,000 interviews, from surfers to fishermen, railway workers to local drifters. They tracked down every man seen on the beach that day. Several witnesses mentioned a strange figure following the girls. Tall, thin, sandy hair, carrying a transistor radio. But when sketches were released, no one could identify him. Then came the first clue. A camera found half buried in the dunes, its film roll still inside. The detectives held their breath as the negatives developed. The photos were ordinary. The girls smiling, posing, squinting against the sun, until the last frame. It was taken from behind. Marianne and Christine were walking away toward the dunes, and in the far background, a shadow. A long, thin silhouette standing on the ridge, watching them. The print was grainy, blurred, impossible to identify. But that shadow became the symbol of the entire case. For weeks, the police chased that ghost, the man with the radio, the shadow on the dune. Theories spread like wildfire. Some believed he was a local fisherman. Others thought he was connected to similar crimes in nearby suburbs, but every lead led nowhere. And then, something strange happened. When detectives returned to the scene weeks later to re-examine the area, they found that someone had disturbed the sand again, at the exact spot where the girls' bodies had been found. Fresh footprints, a cigarette butt, a faint indentation in the shape of a knee, as if the killer had come back. Detective Jones stared out over the empty beach that night, the tide whispering against the shore. He told his partner, "He's not done. He'll come back again." He was right, because what they were about to uncover next, in a nearby suburb, inside a quiet family's home, would turn the investigation upside down. 2 weeks after the discovery, fear had settled over Sydney like a damp fog. Parents locked doors, local beaches emptied, and the headlines wouldn't let the story die. The faces of Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt stared out from every newspaper, their bright teenage smiles now frozen symbols of innocence lost. Detective Inspector John Jones hadn't slept properly since the day the bodies were found. Every night, he replayed the same image in his mind, the camera photo, the faint outline of a man watching from the dunes. He was convinced the key lay in that shadow. So when a local woman named Mrs. Hanlon called the station, saying she'd seen a man burying something in the dunes weeks before the murders, Jones drove straight to her house himself. Her story was simple but unsettling. It was late December 1964, just after Christmas. She was walking her dog along the upper dunes when she saw a man crouched near the fence line. He was digging. At first, she thought he might have been hiding trash or fishing gear, but when he noticed her watching, he froze. "He just stared," she said, voice trembling as she recalled it. "Didn't move, didn't say a word. Then he smiled, just a small one, but it felt wrong." She described him as thin, pale, mid-30s, with light hair and a long scar along his jaw. Jones took notes, pretending not to feel the chill running through his veins. Because that same description, the pale man, the scar, had appeared twice before, in police reports from other unsolved attacks across New South Wales. The Wanda Beach Task Force, nicknamed Operation Dune, expanded overnight. Detectives re-examined earlier cases involving teenage girls attacked in remote areas. One case stood out, a 1963 assault near North Narrabeen Beach, 40 minutes north of Wanda. The victim, a young woman, survived but never saw her attacker's face. She remembered his smell though, a mix of seabolt and engine oil. Police retrieved the old evidence, sea box. Inside were fibers, shoe prints, and a piece of torn canvas. Jones's instinct told him it was the same man. He ordered a cross-comparison of fibers from the Narrabeen case with those collected from the Wanda scene. Days later, the lab report landed on his desk. Match confirmed. That should have been the breakthrough, but instead, it opened a deeper hole. When they pulled old records on the canvas manufacturer, they found it was standard issue for Royal Australian Navy supply tarps used in the early 1960s. Thousands of servicemen had access to it. Narrowing that list was like finding a single grain of sand in a desert. But one name caught Jones's eye. James Ryan, a Navy technician dishonorably discharged in 1964 for conduct unbecoming. His file was sealed, but rumor had it he'd been caught spying on women through dorm windows at the base. Ryan had since moved to Cronulla, a 10-minute drive from Wanda Beach. Detectives visited his address, a small weatherboard house at the end of a cul-de-sac. No car in the driveway, curtains drawn. When they knocked, no answer. But the neighbor, an older man washing his porch, looked up and said, "You're looking for Jimmy? He's gone. Packed up last week. Said he was heading north to work on boats." Jones's guts sank. The timing was too perfect. Inside, the house was bare, except for one room. In it, detectives found a workbench lined with tools, bits of rope, and a folded beach towel still dusted with sand. The towel's tag read, "Property of Cronulla Surf Club." Then, beneath a loose floorboard, they found something even stranger, a glass jar containing strands of blonde hair sealed tight. Jones didn't need the lab to tell him it wasn't random. News of the discovery was never released to the public. Investigators feared a panic, or worse, that Ryan would vanish completely. They circulated his description through police channels, but weeks passed with no sighting. Then, In March 1965, a postmaster in Newcastle, 100 miles north, reported something odd. A man matching Ryan's description had rented a post office box and collected several large envelopes marked photographs, handle with care. When detectives arrived, the man was gone again, but they found one undeveloped film canister left behind. The photos, once processed, sent shivers through the entire task force. They weren't of the beach, they weren't of random scenery, they were close-ups, faces of teenage girls in school uniforms, all taken from a distance, some looking directly at the camera as if they'd just noticed the photographer. Jones pinned the photos to the wall of the task force office, one by one. "This isn't just a murder," he told his team quietly. "It's a pattern, and he's hunting." But the evidence trail turned cold again. Months later, a sailor stationed in Brisbane was arrested for unrelated offenses. During questioning, he mentioned an odd drifter he'd worked with, a man with a scar who always carried a small radio and took photos of women. "He said he used to go down to the beach to find angels," the sailor muttered. "What did he mean by that?" the detective asked. "He said the sea always brings them back." By winter, the Wanda Beach case had stalled. The media moved on. New crimes filled the headlines, but for Jones, the case became an obsession. He began receiving anonymous letters, typed, unsigned, but always referencing details that hadn't been released to the public. One letter read simply, "You're looking in the wrong direction. The sand hides more than the sea ever could." The postmark was from Queensland, the same region where Ryan was last seen. Jones wanted to believe it was a taunt from the killer himself, but deep down, something didn't fit. Because a forensic analyst reviewing the hair from the jar had discovered something critical, the strands didn't belong to either Christine or Marianne. They belonged to someone else entirely, another unknown victim. And when Jones tracked the serial number on the film canisters to their original distributor, he made a chilling discovery. The camera that took those photos had been sold 2 months before the murders to a man named W. Schmidt, Marianne's father. Detective John Jones stared at the typewritten report on his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he read the name again. Camera serial number registered to Wilhelm Schmidt. Marianne's father. For hours, the detective sat in silence. The only sound in the room, the faint hum of the ceiling fan, and the steady tick of the clock. He couldn't comprehend it at the man who had begged for answers, who had broken down in front of reporters, who had buried his daughter. Could he somehow be connected to the evidence? The next morning, Jones drove to the Schmidt home in Ryde. The house was small, quiet, and shadowed by a tall gum tree that cast long branches across the windows. Mrs. Schmidt answered the door, her eyes hollow but polite. "Please," she said softly. "No more cameras, no more questions." Jones nodded. "Just one more." He asked to speak with Wilhelm. She hesitated, then led him to the back shed, a small, tin-roofed workspace cluttered with tools, boxes, and stacks of old photographs. Wilhelm sat at a bench, polishing a broken wristwatch, his face expressionless. "Mr. Schmidt," Jones began carefully, "we've traced a camera to your name, the same model used to take photographs connected to your daughter's case." The man froze mid-motion. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Wilhelm sighed deeply, setting the watch down. "That camera was mine," he said, "but I sold it before Christmas, to a man I met at the docks. He wanted it for photography, paid me £5. Jones leaned forward. "Do you remember his name?" Wilhelm frowned, thinking. "No, but he had a scar, right here." He touched his jawline, like it had been cut open once. Jones's heart dropped. The scar. The same description repeated by Mrs. Hanlon, by witnesses at the beach, and by the sailor in Brisbane. The same man who had vanished James Ryan. The revelation should have been a breakthrough, but instead, it deepened the labyrinth. If Ryan had bought the camera from Wilhelm Schmidt, then the connection between the families wasn't coincidence, it was proximity. Ryan knew where the Schmidts lived. He may have even followed them. And then, in a chilling twist, new information arrived from a retired police constable who'd worked security near the Cronulla rail station. He remembered a man matching Ryan's description approaching 2 girls on the platform around 12:30 p.m. the day of the murders. He was holding something in his hand, a small portable radio. He offered to show them a shortcut to the beach. The girls followed him. That was the last confirmed sighting of Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt alive. Jones threw himself into finding Ryan again. He dug through tax records, border control manifests, even military archives. Eventually, he found something buried in the Navy's classified section, a personnel file on James Ryan's final disciplinary hearing. It described patterned behavioral deviance, voyeurism, and repeated psychological evaluations. A note at the bottom of the file read, "Subject displays obsession with surveillance, photography, and control. Potential psychopathy indicated. Recommended long-term evaluation declined." He'd been dismissed from service with no follow-up, free to walk the streets. Jones read the line 3 times, each word feeling heavier than the last.